We had Louis who introduced us in the idea of reducing things to just improve current lifestyles with efficiency and technology. And in our working group, the question of equity came up very quickly. And I'm very happy to have Milena Buchs with us. She's Associate Professor in Sustainability, Economics and Low Carbon Transitions at the University of Leeds. She's focused, or her research focuses on fair climate policies and sustainable welfare. And I'm very happy to have you with us and introduce the idea of equity, or how to distribute these reduction ideas. Milena, the stage is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christoph. It's wonderful to be part of this workshop. Good, excellent. Yes, so I think equity is a really important topic when we talk about sustainable lifestyles, especially radical 1.5-degree lifestyles. So what I was planning to do is to just give a really brief input to say, why is equity important? It's important for two reasons, really. I'm sure all already familiar with the term of the just transition. So the low carbon transition needs to be just and inclusive for everyone. But also making this transition more equitable has actually, I think, hopefully positive impacts on the acceptability and also effectiveness of radical climate policies. And I will explain briefly why. And then thirdly, I will just talk about some sort of more higher level policy implications of these equity issues that we see in this transition to a low carbon society. So talking then about the just transition, this is obviously a key component of the European Green Deal. And the just transition is really not only about workers, let's say, in high carbon industries, but the just transition, ideally, I think, should respond to what you could call the triple injustice of climate change. So what is this triple injustice? So people who are poorer, for example, or less well off more generally, more vulnerable, you could maybe say, they are the ones who are least responsible for the problem, least responsible for climate change because they have very low emissions. At the same time, however, they are most impacted by climate change and, as we will see, also by climate policies, at least some climate policies. And then also, thirdly, their capacity to mitigate, i.e. to reduce their own emissions and to adapt to climate change is compromised compared to richer people. So these three things together, yeah, you can say that is the triple injustice that ideally we should try to avoid with our climate policies, and even try to address ideally in the way in which we design climate policies, or policies that in our context here support the 1.5-degree lifestyles. These issues, this is just an aside comment in a way, but it's actually quite important in a way to say this is not only important within generations, but it is also important across generations. So anything we do now to reduce emissions will help future generations to satisfy their needs, to be able to adapt to climate change, etc. And of course, the voices of people in future generations are not even yet part of this whole process. So in terms of responsibility, then I go briefly through these three elements of responsibility, impact and capability. So in terms of responsibility, I'm sure we know that emissions, for example, are highly unequally distributed, not only across the world. I think Lewis has given us some really nice graphs there, but also within the EU. For example, the top 10% of the population emits nearly a third of all total household emissions, whereas the bottom half of the population only emits a quarter of all emissions. So we can express this inequality also with the Gini coefficient, which we know from income inequality research, and it is fairly high with 36%. Also, emissions are very unequally distributed across income, So the highest income groups have substantially higher total carbon footprints. These figures here are from 27 EU countries at the household level. So then talking about impacts, the problem with some climate policies is that they have regressive effects, which means that they burden low-income households and other vulnerable households more than rich households relative to their income. So on this graph here, you can see the tax burden from a €50 a ton carbon tax and how this is distributed across income. And it's expressed as a multiple of the tax burden that the fifth income quintile, i.e. the richest people, have. And so what we can see here is that really sort of any policies that increase prices of necessities, that can be carbon taxes, but it can also be other policies that lead to price increases of necessities, are very regressive. Yeah, so the red line here for home energy, which is the necessity, is the steepest line. Actually, I didn't put food on here, but this would be fairly similar to home energy. These lines are flatter for things like travel. This is mainly because car ownership, for example, is still quite unequally distributed in society. Poorer people tend to, be greater users of buses, for example, and less likely to have a car in the first place. And the only progressive tax here is the frequent flyer levy, because participation in air travel again comes mainly from highly educated and higher income groups in society. So these are the types of impacts that we need to avoid, these sort of regressive impacts, because they are basically just unfair. In terms of justice also, of course, climate change and other environmental problems often affect, not always I would say, but often affect poorer and more vulnerable groups more than richer people. So for example, on this map here, we can see that lives lost attributable to air pollution is much higher in Eastern European and some Southern European countries, which are poorer countries compared to Scandinavia, for example, or Great Britain. And we see similar patterns also at an individual level, where again, people who are on lower incomes and unemployment or suffer from health conditions are more affected and exposed to air pollution, flooding, and environmental problems like that. So again, this is one of these inequalities that I have been talking about, or injustices. In terms of people's capacity, this is also very unequally distributed. The capacity to be green. The sad fact is that often being green means, spending more money, because many of the green things that we can do at the moment are more expensive than the more polluting options. So here, for example, based on some Eurobarometer data, you can see how many times more likely richer people are compared to poorer people to, for example, have a low emission car or to have a solar panel to insulate their home, etc. We've also recently done a study on the consumption of plant-based alternatives to dairy products. And again, there's a very steep social gradient here, mainly because these products are more expensive than the milk that we buy or other dairy products that we buy in the supermarket. All of this together leads to, sadly, to an opposition against certain types of climate policies. So even though awareness of climate change and worry about climate change is actually quite high in Europe, opposition against certain policies, for example, fuel taxes, is also really high. So in some countries, we see more than half of the population actually being against things like fuel taxes because they're perceived as unfair. And we've also looked at this at the individual level to sort of see, okay, what drives opposition? It's mainly low income, low education, and fuel poverty in addition to the people who are against it, they are also less worried about climate change and they trust politicians less. So these are also problems, but low income and fuel poverty and things like that are very important drivers. So the hope would be that if we can design climate policies in a fairer way, that would increase the public acceptability of these policies. And that's, of course, important for them to be effective in the first place. So I come to the end then to just highlight some policy implications in very, very generic terms. Obviously, I'm really interested to see how this plays out in the workshop in a moment, to see how we can apply this to more concrete policies. So as the headline here, what I would like to suggest is target high emitters and support the vulnerable. So to take that as a sort of principle that can guide the design of fair climate policies. So what could targeting higher emitters mean? It basically means things like putting the financial burdens for reductions in emissions on those who are most responsible and have the greatest capacity to pay. So not like it is at the moment, that the greatest burdens are on the poorest people often. It could include things like targeting luxuries. You could even say, targeting excess consumption. So the phrase of consumption corridors already was already used in the previous workshop. So things like that could slot in there. But also more generally, I think, thinking about how we can use the unequal distribution of income and wealth actually as a resource for financing the just transition. And then on the flip side is, of course, supporting the vulnerable, that we should always have in mind, okay, we need to try and compensate poorer people, more vulnerable people for regressive effects or other negative effects of climate change policies. That could be either through financial compensations, but it could also be by providing them, for example, with green services, green living options, and basically subsidize it for people who are less able to afford them. Also guarantee and improve basic need satisfaction. So basically trying to avoid that climate policies increase things like fuel poverty, transport poverty, and poverty more generally. And of course, the third point here, I think we have already touched on this at several points in the workshop, to say to enable people to be green, we need to have certain green infrastructures and certain institutions, policies that incentivize and support people to actually be green. Yeah, it can't be left entirely to basically voluntary choice to do that, because otherwise it will only be the rich who do it. So my 3 takeaway points then as a summary: the just transition needs to be fair. The second point is this fairness makes hopefully climate policies and 1.5-degree lifestyle policies more acceptable and therefore more effective. And how should we do this? Well, one guiding principle could be to make society more equitable in the first place, more inclusive as well, and then to target high emitters and support the vulnerable, as I've explained on the last slide. Great, I leave it here, and I'm very much looking forward how we can apply this to actual policy discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milena.